All right. Hello, everyone. This is Wes Niemans. I am here from Kognito. If I can have our presenters just mute their phones for a moment as I go through some housekeeping. We have a lot of folks joining us today, and we are really excited that you have joined us today. Obviously, we're going to acknowledge what happened this week and how that affects, obviously the content of this webinar and certainly affects the lives of our young students who are trans or gender nonconforming in schools. And so we just want to take this moment to acknowledge that and acknowledge, I think, the fear and the uncertainty and anxiety I think that a lot of trans students and gender nonconforming students are facing, and the people who love and support them. And so today we are really here to focus on that and focus on the things that we can do regardless of whether or not there are legal protections for those students, things that we can do right now and right here in order to show our support and stand up for those students. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This presentation is being recorded. So we will be happy to send a copy of this recording to you after the presentation. Our presenters today are fantastic experts from the field. There is a lot of content and a lot of information on these slides. I want to just start by saying we're not going to be able to get and cover in detail all of that information, but it will be sent to you for you to look in and dive in and kind of take a deeper look at after we're finished today. You are all in listen-only mode, which means we're going to ask you to please utilize the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can type in your questions there, I will field them and answer them. Our first presenter today is Dr. Jenny Beeman. Dr. Jenny Beeman is the director of Stonewall Center at UMass Amherst, and they are going to start off today as really a leading expert in this field to talk to us specifically about what they are doing and their knowledge on the subject matter, and really spend the first 30 minutes talking about that. Jenny has to go at 1:30, and so we're going to try to utilize their time as much as possible. And so if you have questions for Jenny, please make sure, if they're specific to Jenny and their content, please make sure that you're utilizing the first 30 minutes to ask those questions. Obviously, I don't think we're going to get to everyone's questions, but please feel free to still submit them, and I will make sure that you get an answer to your question after the webinar is over. We also have Shane Windmeyer, who is the founder and executive director of Campus Pride, joining us, and Campus Pride has been an excellent partner to Kognito. They helped us create our simulations, and so we are really, really excited to have Shane here as well. And we are waiting on Tim Kordick, who is the project advisor for LAUSD and their work regarding LGBTQ students in schools. I want to jump in because we have so much to cover today, and we want to make the best use of our time. So I am going to pass on to Jenny. Jenny, take it from here, and we are excited that you are here to share with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate everyone being here. This is a really difficult time to be having this kind of event when so much is going on our campuses and at our schools, and our students are often struggling with what the election outcome is and really feeling that their very survival is at stake. And so I think that what we're talking about is really important to be trying to address as we try to, in a sense, pick up the pieces and see where we can go from here in supporting our trans students around some of the issues covered by Title IX. Because probably as many of you know that the incoming administration has announced during the campaign that if they were elected, they were going to change Title IX so that it does not cover trans students. And so the Dear Colleague letter, which I will discuss a little bit, is going to they're going to try to rescind that. And so the sort of protections that we've been advocating for years for colleges to be putting in place are really going to be dependent on colleges really to do, because the federal government is not going to be behind them in making that happen. So next slide, please. So I have a few slides here on terms. Because you'll get a copy of this presentation, I'm going to skip over that really to get to really the heart of the conversation, especially in light of, again, what has happened this week. So you can go to the next slide as well. So Title IX, where things have stood is that schools and colleges have to prohibit discrimination based upon gender identity expression, give trans students, really anyone based upon gender identity, equal access to programs, facilities, and activities, and treat trans students in accordance with their gender identity. The way Departments of Education and Justice have been looking at this issue is that whenever sex discrimination is talked about in institutional policies, we're also talking about gender identity. Next slide. Next slide. I'm not seeing. I'm not getting a next slide.
Oh, sorry. Jenny, we're on the Title IX overview on schools, colleges must treat students in accordance with their gender identity.
Okay, yes, I see it now. Okay, so again, the way things have been is that for the last few years, as the government has said, we have to be treating students in accordance with how they articulate their identities. That if someone indicates that this is how I identify, we are obligated to respect that. Doesn't matter what their assignment was at birth, doesn't matter their gender presentation, whether they've had any sort of psychological diagnosis or planning to transition, have had any steps to take in that regard, what legal documents say, and what other people might say. That if let's say a trans woman wants to be using a woman's bathroom, she has every right to be doing so, and no one has the right to tell her otherwise. If someone has an issue with that, it's really that person's issue, and they can go someplace else. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Dear Colleague letter came out in May from Departments of Ed and Justice that basically articulated how colleges and schools should be implementing Title IX when it comes to protecting the rights of trans students. Covered 4 areas: non-discrimination, name and pronouns, facility access, and privacy. And I'll touch on all 4 of these, really with the focus on what we need to be doing in light of the fact that Title IX might be going away, at least when it comes to trans students. So next slide. So Title IX says that we have to be providing non-discriminatory environments for our trans students based upon gender identity, take prompt effective steps if it occurs, and to prevent its reoccurrence. So if your school doesn't already have a non-discrimination policy that includes gender identity and expression, it really needs to have one ASAP, because that's a basic thing for our trans students to be able to have a sense of protection. And also to be educating our folks who do investigations around harassment and assault, whether that's a dean of students office, police departments, Title IX case managers, affirmative action office. We need to be educating those individuals around the needs and experiences of trans people to best be able to support them. Next slide. So there we go. So some examples of discrimination against trans people that are very specific to trans people that are covered by Title IX, but again, this is what institutions should be doing. If you have, for example, a Title IX web page at your institution, this information should be there so that trans students know that their rights are protected and know that there are ways in which they're covered, from discrimination and from harassment. So these are some of the categories that should be named very explicitly as forms of harassment that students can legitimately file a complaint about with affirmative action or with the Dean of Students Office or whatever process you have in place at an institution. So purposely referring to a trans person by what trans people say is being their dead name, the name that they no longer use, it's dead to them, or using the wrong pronouns. And it's a malicious doing so. It's not just getting it wrong once or twice. It's getting it wrong when someone's constantly corrected you on that, or doing so on purpose. That's a form of harassment. That's denying someone the right to be who they are. Also asking invasive questions about someone's body or transition. We don't ask other people what quote unquote is in their pants. We shouldn't be asking trans people that either. Divulging a person's dead name or assignment at birth, that's considered confidential information. You're subjecting someone to discrimination, possibly, to violence, possibly, if that gets disclosed. And denying access to facilities in keeping with one's gender identity would also be an example of harassment. So these are all things that a college should be putting out there and saying, if you're a trans person, you experience this, let us know so we can address this. Next slide. So I'm not seeing it, but I'm gonna go as if the next slide is up there. Trans people experience particular forms of harassment that are the same as other individuals do on college campus in terms of sexual harassment. Studies have shown, and particularly the AAU study that came out last year, that trans people experience much greater rates of sexual assault, sexual harassment than do other groups at colleges. This is one stat that I pulled from the report, but basically every area that they looked at, whether it was sexual harassment, sexual assault, stalking, intimate partner violence, trans individuals had higher rates than did other groups of people, including cisgender or non-transgender women, and at the same time were the least likely group to report that because of, as I say here on the slide, fear of retaliation, fear of not being taken seriously, or also being further victimized, a concern that if they were to tell someone, the person would further make this worse by not treating them with respect. So again, we need to be educating our folks on campus who work with survivors about the needs of trans people so that we can be supporting our trans people and encouraging them to go forward and feel like if they do, it's going to mean something. Next slide, please. So another area of Title IX is around documents, pronouns, names, that we have to be respecting the name and pronouns that students use, even if it's not what is on their documents. Again, this might very well be going away, so we need to be putting in place policies at our institutions to be ensuring that students can use the name, use the pronouns that they use for themselves, and have a policy which basically says that we're going to respect a name, a pronoun that people use for themselves. So, for example, have a way for students to have a chosen name on all non-legal documents. And I list some here. The only places you really need to have a student's legal name is, as you might expect, a legal document, which is an official transcript. It's bursar records, it's financial aid records, it's employment records, things that are tied to the IRS, to Social Security, to federal reporting. Anything else an institution can decide for itself, like diplomas or ID cards. Those are open for institutions to be able to put whatever name a student wants to have on them. They are not considered to be legal documents, at least in terms of diplomas for undergraduates in medical professions, nursing, dentistry. They are considered legal documents because you have to present them as a credential. But for most students, diploma is not a legal document, and so that could be changed to any name a student desires. Next slide. So also giving students the ability to change the gender marker on their records upon request. Again, there's nothing preventing an institution from deciding how they want to be treating a student. And so giving the student the ability to indicate the gender that they use for themselves or how they see themselves is really important to be doing. And to indicate pronouns. If we are going to be respecting how students identify themselves, we need to give students the ability to indicate that this is how they identify themselves. Now, students may choose not to want to disclose that, and that's totally fine. This is not designed to make students have to essentially out themselves, but it's to give students the ability to indicate if they want to, this is who I am. And I suggest that we be asking pronouns in classes, in meetings and such, and not requiring people to indicate the pronouns that they use, but giving people that opportunity so people aren't being misgendered. It gives the person to decide for themselves, is this a safe, inclusive, welcoming environment where I feel safe, indicating the pronouns that I use for myself, or do I not want to do that, rather than giving that power to name and potentially misgender to somebody else who's leading that meeting or who's teaching that class. So it's really important to give our students the right to make those decisions for themselves. Next slide. And this information should all be available for students to find out how to make this happen, so that they don't have to be trying to figure this out on their own and such. There should be a website that has the information and has the policies that institutions have when it comes to respecting students, how they identify. There are a number of steps we can take to be supportive ourselves in terms of having pronouns, our own pronouns and name tags, email signatures, introducing ourselves that way, basically trying to normalize the culture of giving people the ability to indicate how they identify themselves, and recognizing that we all have a gender, and it's not just people who are trans who have a gender, and recognizing that we need to be not making assumptions about how someone identifies, and besides gender pronouns, not using gender forms of address like Mr. or Ms. or Sir and Ma'am, unless we know indeed that's how the student wants to be referenced. We would not do that about other aspects of identity. We would never call out assumptions about someone's race or religion or whatnot. But we do it around gender because we gender people in our language, and we need to recognize that we are making assumptions there and try to limit that and be asking rather than making those assumptions. Next slide. So this is a policy that we have here that we are trying to promote for faculty to put on syllabi, which again basically says whenever there is a class where it's small enough where we're going to have people indicate their names, we are going to also give them a chance to indicate their pronouns as well. And again, you'll have this so you can adopt this policy or encourage your faculty to adopt this policy. It's again, a way to show respect for trans people in the classroom. Next slide. So facilities, another area covered by Title IX, which is sort of up in the air, but we're going to have to address this on our campuses as well as people have the right to use facilities in keeping with how they identify themselves, which many of our trans students identify as non-binary at colleges. We make sure we need to have gender-inclusive bathrooms, restrooms, locker rooms, and housing. That a trans student may very well want to use a gender-inclusive space, facility, but they cannot be required to do so. That if a trans woman, let's say, wants to be using a woman's restroom, she has every right to be there. Telling her that she can only use, let's say, a facility for people of all genders is segregation, and that's illegal. Next slide. So this is the policy we developed a few years ago at UMass Amherst, which again, I would really strongly encourage institutions to develop something like this because again, if Title IX goes away, trans students don't have that protection to be using the restroom or bathroom that's in keeping with their gender identity, unless there might happen to be a state law in your state. But it's really important that our students know that they are protected. This is something we put in place here, which basically says that people should use the facility that they feel safest, most comfortable using. It references both sex and gender identity, recognizing that different people would have different needs. That, for example, a trans woman who's just beginning to transition may look traditionally male, and so she may not feel comfortable in a women's restroom. She has every right to be there, but she may not feel like that's a good space for her, so may want to use gender-inclusive facilities only, or may want to be using men's rooms because that's how people are going to perceive her. So we want to be flexible here. The idea is to try to limit the gender policing of bathrooms and restrooms and the harassment going on there. Next slide. So I sort of just covered this. I can skip this one and go to the next one. So one of the great things that we just got a public accommodation law that includes gender identity, and one of the positive aspects of that was our Attorney General's office came out with some guidelines about how to implement that law, and it's very much in keeping with what our policies have been on our campus, and we actually have basically gotten rid of like what we had said and basically just substituted the Attorney General's language because it's good language, and it comes from the state, and so it's like it has more power than us. But basically, there are some points here I want to just go through. Not assuming how someone identifies based upon their gender by relying upon gender stereotypes, recognizing that just because a trans person is in a facility does not mean that they are in the wrong facility, that folks have to really assess if someone brings a complaint about someone being in the wrong bathroom, whether that indeed is legitimate, because most of the time, almost all the time, it is really not legitimate. Next slide. So again, the Attorney General's office from our state says that, again, that this is rare, and people should basically just presume someone is in the correct facility for them, the one that's consistent with how they identify, unless there's a real reason to believe that they are not, which basically comes down to, is this person doing something inappropriate? If they're just simply using the bathroom, let it go. If they're doing something criminal, that's an issue. If they're like loitering to look at people, if they're harassing people, taking pictures or video, yeah, those are all issues. Those are all criminal matters and should be addressed. But basically, if someone's just there to use the facility, assume that they're in a place that works best for them. If there is a conversation that one needs to have around potentially someone using a facility, as our Attorney General's office says, make sure it's done discreetly and in private. And if the person says, no, I'm good, I'm using the facility that corresponds to how I identify, pretty much end of the conversation, because the person, again, hasn't done anything inappropriate. But this is a real issue because large national study of trans people found that 1 in 10 trans people had experienced harassment in a restroom, and about 1 in 10 had also been denied access to a restroom because of their gender identity and expression. Next slide. So some of the best practices here, again, to be supportive of our trans students is to take facilities and make them gender inclusive. There's no reason not to take single occupancy men's and women's restrooms and make all of them just be restrooms. Take away the gender. In our state, Massachusetts, we have limits on multi-user bathrooms. We cannot readily simply make them women's and men's. I'm sorry, make them not be women's and men's. But for all of our single user ones, we can, and we've done so because there's no reason to gender them. One person's using it at a time. It doesn't matter the gender of the person who's using it. Signage is really important here. The stick figures are really offensive. The half male, half female stick figure is no more inclusive. It reinforces the gender binary. Trans people are not half male, half female. So for us at UMass Amherst, we basically decided just to not have any icon on a sign and just have the wheelchair accessible symbol if it's wheelchair accessible. I know some colleges have added a toilet symbol to have some pictogram there, but anything that uses stick figures is really going to be not inclusive. And then we decided also on our campus just to say restroom. There's no reason to gender it, to have to label it in any current sort of gender way. So we just say restroom. People know what that language is. Saying a family restroom is not trans inclusive. Unisex restroom, people don't know what that means. And gender neutral is not the best language because we're not trying to neutralize gender. We're trying to be more open about gender, more gender inclusive. And it's important to have a map of where these gender inclusive restrooms are on your campus. I talk in my research with many trans students who will only use gender inclusive facilities. And so they need to know where those are. And there needs to be a whole bunch of them. What we are trying to do, next slide. What we're trying to do at UMass Amherst is to pretty much have all of our buildings have at least one gender inclusive restroom. We have a policy that when we renovate a building, put up a building, that we're going to include a whole bunch of gender inclusive restrooms, at least one per floor. And then hopefully in a few years, we're going to have most of campus covered, and then also seeking to do very specific renovations in places where there aren't a lot of gender inclusive restrooms to make sure we have them, because again, it's really important that our students having a place to go to the bathroom is pretty essential. Yet a lot of our students nationally will have to plan their day around where there are bathrooms because they don't feel safe and comfortable in gendered bathrooms, and that's just really unfair and inappropriate to subjecting our students to that. Changing shower rooms also have to be more inclusive, to be including privacy for our students as well. There are a couple ways to be doing that I say here. Next slide.
Okay. Jenny, this is Wes. I just want to double check. We're almost at 1:30, and so we do have a question here specifically for you. Would you want that question now, or do you want to try to finish your slides quickly?
Let me just finish the last couple slides that I have here, if I could.
Okay. Go for it.
Want to do the next one? So I am not seeing the slide, but I'll go on to it anyway. The other area that Title IX covers is around activities. When it comes to fraternities, sororities, athletics, housing, single-sex schools, Title IX doesn't specifically cover trans inclusion, but campus policies do or can. So again, going to the next slide, which I'm not sure if you are seeing, the way that Title IX reads is that there is those exclusions that I just mentioned, but basically any other thing there is not that out. So that, for example, student organizations can't be doing sex segregated events and having events where they're bestowing gender titles like homecoming king, queen, those sort of things, because that is not inclusive. So we need to be making sure that our student organizations and our campus departments are not sponsoring events that are sex segregated, that are treating gender as being a binary. And athletics, again, not covered by Title IX per se, but recognizing as well with the Dear Colleague letter that we need to make sure we're trying to include trans students the best we can. And the last piece of this is around privacy, that we need to keep information about a trans student's dead name, about their assigned sex as confidential, because that is private information, and FERPA also comes into play here in terms of we cannot disclose information from a student's record without a legitimate educational interest in doing so. So I'll quickly get to that question before I have to leave.
All right, so the question we have here is, Dr. Beeman, looking for any suggestions for supporting students in a state where discrimination has been written into law. We have no local policies as our system is being sued by the Department of Justice. None of these practices can be done transparently.
In terms of I'm going to take that transparently as they cannot be done above board because of the political climate. I'm going to say
right.
That's what
yeah,
the,
I think so.
Yeah, that makes it really tough, because how do you support people in a state, in a college system where doing so is illegal? And so many of our trans students now are voting with their feet and choosing not to go to places like North Carolina for school. I'm hearing from colleagues who are in North Carolina that they're seeing a lot fewer trans students applying there and going out of state to school because the environment there is just so hostile to trans people. Yeah, it's hard. I think there needs to be put in place support systems that, in trying to publicize them outside of legal changes, then to be able to, if you can't put formal policies in place, have informal policies that support trans students. I know that, for example, some colleges where they could not do something in terms of changing they couldn't publicize something around housing, for example, but were able to accommodate that student when that person came to them, even though they didn't have a formal policy around gender inclusive housing. They were able to find some way to give that person the correct roommate and to put them in a safe space, even though there was no formal policy. So working on sort of informal ways to be supportive in the absence of ways that you can really be publicizing inclusiveness.
Thank you, Jenny. One other, I think, do you have time for one more question?
Sure, I can do one more question.
Okay, so this is a really great question, which is, how do you suggest to create a policy or even kind of have a conversation regarding students who identify as non-binary and want to join one of the sex-segregated groups? So let's say a male group on campus that offers many perks. The question is, how do we as a school ask a student to choose between the all-male and use the perks, but then not use the all-female group for better perks? Basically, how do you not, with a student who maybe straddles the binary or does not identify on the binary, what kind of, if you have sex-segregated groups on campus, where does that student fit in?
That's a tough question that we face in doing this sort of work. Clearly, someone who identifies as trans female, trans male has to be treated as any female or male student respectively. That even though, for example, and I didn't mention this but I want to mention it now, even though Title IX doesn't apply to fraternities and sororities, and of course if Title IX goes away then it's going to be a moot point anyway, college non-discrimination policies do. So if you have gender identity expression in your non-discrimination policy, it means that fraternities and sororities, if they're recognized by the institution, have to admit students in keeping with their gender identity. So a trans male student, for example, has every right to be joining a fraternity, and they cannot turn that person away simply based upon that individual's gender identity. It gets a lot trickier when you have students who are non-binary and we have sex-segregated activities, and no one is saying that we should eliminate fraternities and sororities or eliminate athletic teams. Well, maybe I should say, maybe some people are saying that, but there's no push around Title IX, for example, to eliminate those sort of activities. But then where does that leave people who are non-binary? We are really struggling with this at my own institution around intramural policies. To where if you have, obviously you can have teams that are mixed gender, okay, so trans people can join those teams, but a lot of those mixed gender teams also have gendered rules in place to prevent those teams from being dominated by men. I was having a conversation the other day with our director of intramurals, who was talking to me about the rules for flag football. That the league rules for intramural flag football say that you can only throw a pass to someone who's a man twice in a row, because they don't want men simply to run the game and to be keep throwing the ball to men, and so women basically are sidelined and not given equal chance to participate, which is all fine and good to try to make it so that women are more included in the game. But what do you do about then when you're talking about trans students who don't identify as male or female? So how do you address that at the same time trying to address and make sure that women are included? No one has any answers to this, unfortunately. These are the things that we struggle with, and I don't know that anyone has good policy other than to try to get people to play fairly and to be as inclusive as possible, and call people out when they're not being as inclusive as they need to be.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. I think that you highlight really, the questions that we're getting that are really, really specific and great questions, I think highlight the broader issue we have as a culture in creating these sex-segregated spaces for people, and what that actually means for people who don't fit there. So, I think that you provided an excellent kind of answer on that. I know that your time is up, and I want to be respectful of that. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Dr. Beeman, before we move on?
Nope, just my email is there, I think. Please feel free to contact me. I apologize for having to not be able to say as much, and of course with Title IX so up in the air at this point, there's a whole lot more that could be said and I think needs to be said. But bottom line, we need to be doing as much as we can on our individual campuses to be trying to support our students in the likelihood that the federal government is not going to be at all supportive.
Exactly. And as Jenny just said, their contact information is at the end of this webinar, and we're getting a lot of great questions that I'm going to make sure I share with our presenters so that we can maybe even make a document to answer all of your questions, and we will share that with all of the attendees because we do want everyone to have access to that information. Thank you, Jenny, so much for joining us. Before we move on to Shane from Campus Pride, I do have one question here that I want to that I can answer, which is why would Title IX rights go away for trans students go away? And just to answer that really briefly is that the incoming administration, so Obama's administration has clarified that Title IX, which refers to sex discrimination, they issued a directive that said that trans students and gender nonconforming students, if they are discriminated against, that counts as sex discrimination. And so because sex and our understanding of sex and gender has come a long way from when that was written, that is up to interpretation based on the administration. And so the incoming administration has made claims and ran on a platform that said that they would revise Title IX's statements to exclude trans people, and so essentially saying that that does not count as discrimination, sex discrimination, specifically to Title IX. So I wanted to answer that quickly before we moved on to Shane. And without any further ado, I am going to pass to Shane, who again is a great partner of ours and from Campus Pride. Shane, take it away.
Sure, thank you. My name is Shane Winmeyer. I'm the Executive Director and the founder of Campus Pride. Some of you may know about Campus Pride. I encourage you to take a moment if you're in front of a computer or can bring out your smartphone and go to campuspride.org. That's our main website, and we'll be talking about some resources that are available to you to do this work. But before I do it, I do think there needs to be maybe a little bit of a clarification. Dr. Beeman, who is a good friend of mine, it has been a really rough week for all of us after the election who are advocates for LGBT equality, but particularly for someone who lives their lives as a trans person, as a non-binary person. This election wasn't just about a new president. For them, it's about survival. It's about life and death for some of them, particularly our young trans youth, our non-binary youth who exist and are part of our campus communities. And so I hope that we'll take a moment for many of us who are cisgender, who are listening, who are non-trans, to think about that this isn't just about a new president and an interpretation of Title IX. This is really about their lives. And this is a difficult time. So I appreciate Dr. Beeman being part of this webinar today and struggling through what I'm sure is difficult in trying to explain in light of the new administration. Dr. Beeman said many times that Title IX would go away, and what Dr. Beeman is talking about is the interpretation of Title IX by the Obama administration has the potential to be reinterpreted or to have another Dear Colleague letter go out that would change the way that the Obama administration has defined Title IX and its interpretation of gender. And so that's what Wes was alluding to. It's real important, though, that we recognize as administrators, as staff, as faculty, even as student leaders, that this work and what we do does not need to change. We have to be aware of our politics, of the society, of the communities that we live in, and how difficult it may be in places like North Carolina or other aspects of the South or rural America to do this work, but that doesn't mean that the work needs to change. What it means is that we need to work harder, we need to do better. It was Polly Murray who I recently quoted yesterday in my own processing after the election. Polly Murray was a woman, queer woman of color, who was raised in North Carolina and an amazing advocate back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And she said that hope is a song in a weary throat. And what she said by saying hope is a song in a weary throat is that we all have to continue singing. And for some of us, it may be hard to sing because of our own lived experience. But as an advocate for trans people, as an ally to trans people, I think it's important that we continue doing this work, that we continue singing, even though our song may be, weary right now. We have to sing. And the work that Campus Pride does is all about keeping that voice alive, keeping those songs alive toward, racial justice, toward social justice work, toward LGBTQ rights, gender justice. And we're very proud to have a relationship with Kognito, who I know has the same values of inclusion in the work that they're doing. And I want each of us on this webinar to realize if Title IX, if the new administration interprets Title IX to read differently, that doesn't mean that we have to stop including trans people in our campus policies. Campus policies for decades now have superseded and have went beyond state law, local law in our communities. We have had non-discrimination policies that have included sexual orientation, gender identity long before state governments did, and obviously long before our federal governments do, because we don't have equality under our federal law. And so I want to make sure we recognize that, because I hear a lot about this concern around Title IX. Yes, it wasn't until 2014 when I would say the majority of campuses in this country started doing work around Title IX, because they felt like if they didn't, they would lose their federal government money, like their federal aid money, right? So it was a huge carrot for them to say, you know what, we don't want to get sued, we don't want to lose money, so yes, we'll do this Title IX work, and yes, we'll include trans people, and yes, we'll catch up on where we should have been. but we shouldn't have to have a threat of losing money, of fear of a lawsuit to keep us from doing this work and being proactive. At the end of the day, it comes down to the safety of our trans students, of our non-binary students. And the educational atmosphere that we create, allows students to feel safe, to learn, to live, and to grow. And so with that in mind, I want to take a moment to share with you a resource that has helped, over the last decade now, many of your campuses and many campuses that maybe are on the call who don't know about it, become better, become more trans inclusive. And that's the Campus Pride Index. And you can find it by going to campusprideindex.org. And what it does, it allows your campus to take a benchmarking assessment of what you're doing around LGBTQ inclusion and what you can be doing better when it comes to your policies, your programs, and practices. So I believe that every campus in the nation, every campus definitely on this call, should make sure that they participate for free in the Campus Pride Index. And what it will do is it will provide you with a confidential report, a roadmap that allows you to figure out where are we doing well and where can we improve. And it particularly pulls out trans inclusion. Many of the things that Jenny was talking about around trans inclusion are listed in the Campus Pride Index. And what that index does, it allows you to compare to your peer institutions. It allows you to look at, from a trans policy perspective, what may be attainable for you in, let's say, Mississippi, right? There's a lot that we can be creative about when we go about enacting trans inclusive policies or practices. For instance, what Jenny was talking about with single stall restrooms. On many of our campuses still today, especially in rural areas and in southern areas that maybe it's more difficult politically, we have single stall restrooms that have a male gender marker and a female gender marker, right, on the bathrooms. There's no reason for those to have any type of gender specified. And those are somewhat easier and attainable to just put up a sign that says restroom on them, and people go in them, they lock them, and then they leave them, and they unlock them. So, I would encourage us to think about, even in more conservative climates, what can we be doing, right? As opposed to, oh, well, we can never, do X, Y, and Z now because Title IX potentially might be redefined under a new administration. Let's think about what we can do. And that's what the Campus Pride Index allows you to do, is it allows you to think about, okay, out of these 20 different trans-inclusive policies and programs and practices, these 5 we can focus on this year, and we can try our best to implement them. And then after you're done with that year, or 2 years down the road, then you can pick another 2 or 5. Now, some would argue that we need to move faster, and I don't disagree with that. But for those who are in areas, that are not able to move faster, I want to make sure that we all know that we have a role to play and we all have work to do. So the Campus Pride Index, it's free. You can go to campusprideindex.org. If you want to start the assessment, you go to campusprideindex.org/getlisted. That's /getlisted, and I'll make sure that that's shared with you through Kognito after this webinar, so you can start that process. Another thing that I think is really important for you to know is that Campus Pride has a trans policy clearinghouse. And that clearinghouse has the most up-to-date information on what campuses are doing what when it comes to trans inclusion, when it comes to gender affirmation, surgery, when it comes to gender inclusive restrooms and policies. And that can be found under Campus Pride site under our research tab. So I'd encourage you to check that out too. Wes,
and Shane, we're sharing that website right now on the screen for folks to look at. So sorry to interrupt.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
No, I was getting some feedback, so I knew you had popped on. Wes is sharing with you some of these resources. Campus Pride, our trans policy clearinghouse, is an amazing area of the site. Actually, Dr. Jenny Beeman is our volunteer coordinator who is an expert on these issues, is very personally committed to trans inclusion in higher education, and spends countless hours on keeping the Trans Policy Clearinghouse as the go-to place online for institutions of higher learning. And so that's the easy way to get to it is campuspride.org/TPC, which obviously stands for Trans Policy Clearinghouse. That's campuspride.org/TPC. And so definitely check that out. We're adding to it weekly, as we learn about campuses that are doing this work. So I've mentioned two resources, the Campus Pride Index and the Trans Policy Clearinghouse, as far as trans inclusion work and places that you need to know about and resources that you need to be doing. I would also add to the list of resources that trans young people, non-binary young people need to know that they're valued, that there are resources, that you believe in them. We shouldn't put the responsibility for a safe learning environment on the backs of trans students or even faculty and staff who are on your campus who happen to be trans. It is our responsibility as administrators to create those safe learning environments for all of our students, including our trans students. And, it does matter where bathrooms are, right? It does matter, your pronouns that you use in a classroom and that you use, the name of the student and not, maybe a name that is, a dead name as Jenny referred. And so that does matter. Campus Pride has a leadership camp in the summer where we have, I would say, a good number of trans and non-binary students that participate. And the reason why I want to mention this as a resource is because when students are sent to our leadership camp as any type of student, but particularly as transgender, gender non-binary students, they are being told that they matter, that their student leadership matters on their campus, right? And they're being invested in as young trans people, as young non-binary people, to go to a academy, a camp during the summer and bring back resources to their campus. And so that is called Camp Pride. And right now, we've announced our dates. We are based, Campus Pride is based in Charlotte, North Carolina. So Charlotte actually did the right thing in the state of North Carolina and passed the trans inclusion measures that the rest of the state rejected. But it's a difficult time doing this work, and we're doing it in difficult, challenging places where we need to be. So those would be some of the resources that I would share, Wes, from Campus Pride. We have a specific trans area under our resource tab that has many of the resources that Jenny shared as far as, as far as name policies, as far as pronouns, and how to go about enacting those sort of things.
Thank you so much, Shane. Those are invaluable resources to our community, and especially, I think, obviously for folks in higher ed. I think some of the questions that we were getting today were around things like data collection and names, also some things about gender marker and financial aid purposes. Most of our questions did center, I think, a little bit around higher education, and so I do want to highlight Shane and Campus Pride and Dr. Beeman as both, obviously, I think, really well-versed experts in this field and truly invaluable resources for you all in the higher ed sphere. I do want to acknowledge Tim was unable to join us today. We, obviously are so sorry about that. I do, for all of you out there who are in the K-12 sphere, all is not lost. There are plenty of resources available to you all as well, and we have those resources that we are going to share with everyone. So you will have access to this entire presentation in addition to some detailed answers to the questions that you all provided, and we will make those questions publicly available to everyone in addition to the answers. And I just do want to highlight, I think, before we end today, if you have any questions specifically for for Shane, now would be a great time to ask them. But while I wait and see if any of those do come in, I just want to highlight that Kognito, as Shane mentioned, has been a really active partner of Campus Pride as much as we can. And we do have simulations. We are a health simulation company that creates simulations for people to practice conversations in real life. We do that online, but what we do is create scenarios where educators, school staff, anyone working in a school or a campus can learn and kind of interact with virtual trans and LGBTQ students and kind of practice how they would have a conversation if they needed to intervene or show support. One of our scenarios is a trans student going to the admissions office, the administration office to get their gender marker changed on their college ID. So we do have those resources available to help you practice kind of the action of acting and showing your support through conversation and through personal connection with your students. And so we will obviously be providing you with information on those as well. There aren't, I'm looking here, some great questions. Here we say, there's a question for you, Shane. What is the time frame for being listed on the Campus Pride Index after submitting the assessment?
We try to get them done in 2 to 3 weeks. Occasionally we can get them done faster. It depends on the time of year. So if you complete it in October, you can imagine that's a busy time for us, right? As I'm sure it is on your campus. So we do try within 2 or 3 weeks. If you have any issues, if you reach out to our office, we'll do our best to expedite that.
Thank you, Shane. And we do have one more person here. I'm sorry, my voice is a little hoarse. I was out last night protesting. But we do have a question here about, just because the interpretation of Title IX changes, the law remains the same, and that interpretation was based on case law. The case law supports gender discrimination as a form of sex discrimination, so wouldn't the courts still follow that case law pending new appointments? That is a great question, and actually segues into my final point, which is that for trans students and for advocates and supporters of trans students and gender nonconforming students, in the wake of this week, a hashtag has cropped up on Twitter that is incredibly helpful, and that hashtag is #TransLawHelp. And there are trans-identified lawyers and legal professionals who are offering their support and services over Twitter for questions just like that. I'm not a legal expert, but that question I think really points to the confusion that I think a lot of us are facing and trying to find some clarity in. And so, with that uncertainty, I do recommend, in addition to the resources we will send you after this, #TransLawHelp is a great publicly sourced gathering of information on that subject specifically. I want to be respectful of the time. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had over 250 people join us today, which is a really great sign, I think, for us, and really, really comforting to know that there are so many people out there who are compassionate and concerned for the well-being of our transgender and gender non-conforming friends and students. So thank you again for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for more resources from us and for some documents with answers to your questions. We really appreciate you joining us and hope you have a safe and restful rest of your week. Thank you, Shane, and thank you, Dr. Beeman, again for joining us. Take care.